that literally came out last week. Morning Consult polling ranked him as the #1 most popular senator in the entire country.
Progressive political commentator and co-host over at Hill TV's Rising, Krystal Ball, recently went on CNN to talk a little bit about a new CNN poll which shows Bernie Sanders up at the top for the first time this cycle. Now, I'm going to show you a clip of that, but I'm actually going to break it up into parts, and I'm also going to throw in a Rogan clip to help us explain one of the points which Krystal is making. But since I am breaking it up, I am going to put timestamps in the description for the various clips in this segment. But in any case, for the first part, here is Krystal Ball.
Yeah, I'm not particularly surprised because if you look at the numbers throughout this campaign, he's consistently been the most popular candidate in terms of favorability, obviously has this massive grassroots base, the most fundraising numbers. And if you ask voters, not just in this poll, but consistently across polls, who they trust most on the issues that matter most to them, Bernie Sanders comes out on top. So honestly, I think if there hadn't been this relentless narrative against him for years that he was unelectable, he would be running away with this thing. I also think that the Warren attack on him, trying to smear him as a secret sexist or whatever she was trying to say about him, completely backfired, and he appeared above the fray. He also appears above the fray as Biden tries to attack him and wrongly accuses him of putting out a doctored video. All of those things have only served ultimately to strengthen him.
And so, Karen, I think it's fair to say that you may have some residual resentment towards Senator Sanders based on how he and some of his surrogates conducted themselves in 2016. So what do you think when you hear Krystal's argument?
Well, I disagree that he's been wildly popular and wildly maligned for so many years. Look, this is politics. Bernie Sanders is a politician. That's fine. I just want us to be honest about that. But look, more importantly, what I think we're seeing in these numbers is, to what Krystal said, he has a very strong, enthusiastic base. So it's not surprising to me that as we get closer to the Iowa caucus, and no doubt from 2016, he and his team are very clear about what they need to do to win the caucus, because Hillary won last time. They've got that experience, so they know what they need to do in terms of the ground game. And I think, the other piece of this is Senator Sanders really has to show that he can bring the country together and that he can lead our country. He has not always been seen as someone who would be a uniter. And it's interesting to see in our poll two things that really stand out, right? One is, can you beat Trump? That's what people care about the most. That's been very consistent. But also people want somebody who can unite the country. And I actually think that the fray back and forth between Senators Warren and Sanders, I think voters just don't want to see that. They want to see who's going to bring us together, who's going to move us forward. They don't really want to see the sort of infighting.
I mean, honestly, that was just ridiculous. I mean, notice, by the way, the framing from the moderator there, like, oh, you may have some residual resentment based on how the Sanders campaign and their surrogates conducted themselves. Based on what evidence? Based on no information. I mean, you frame it like that, and someone who may not have the information may watch that and be like, oh yeah, the Sanders campaign, they must have done something really bad for her to be able to just say it as if it's like common knowledge or, whatever, that the Sanders campaign conducted themselves poorly, which no evidence for. I mean, Bernie rallied for Clinton something like 39, 40 times. So the idea that Bernie Sanders wasn't out there, trying to help her win. And by the way, a number of progressives were opposed to this. There were a lot of progressives who were like, Bernie shouldn't be out here rallying for Clinton anyway. But I mean, regardless, it didn't seem to make a difference because the media is still smearing him regardless, no matter how much he was out there rallying for Clinton. But anyway, and notice the framing and notice the point which Karen Finney calls Bernie Sanders divisive. No, he's only divisive in your cocktail parties. And you're going to see in the next clip how Karen Finney reacts to Krystal Ball pointing out the fact that Bernie Sanders is the most popular senator. And by the way, this is the same Karen Finney who was in a video I just made a few days ago arguing with Anna Kasparian. But anyway, the reason I wanted to chop up this clip is because one of the points which Krystal makes is Krystal says that, look, if there hadn't been a continuous narrative of Bernie Sanders being unelectable, then he would be just absolutely running away with it. And you look at the numbers, that does seem to be true, right? I mean, if you look at what issues voters care about, Bernie Sanders is up at the top continuously. But then when you turn around and ask voters who they think is most able to beat Donald Trump, they'll say Joe Biden, even though when you look at the actual head-to-head matchups, Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden are always within just a few percentage points of one another. So it doesn't seem to be really true. And voters do seem to say that they really, really care about beating Donald Trump. So it does seem that like one reason why Joe Biden is ahead really is because they think that Joe Biden is the most electable. And that is the message which Joe Biden is essentially running on. He's essentially running on this message that, oh, he's the one who can beat Donald Trump. Bernie Sanders is like, crazy or whatever. The thing, though, that's interesting about this, especially when it's brought up in the context of, the whole Bernie Warren thing, it was kind of talked a little bit about in that clip, is that, one of the interesting things about that Bernie Warren thing is that, the Warren media strategist, the Warren team, whatever, gave a story to the media and spun it in a certain way, and it spun the exact way in the news cycle how the Warren campaign wanted it to spin. However, there was still a disconnect between voters because then Bernie went up in the polls, he didn't go down, and so it would seem then, I mean, obviously, right, the media is kind of in a bubble, and they have certain things that they think are persuasive, that they think are, things that people are interested in, which is kind of disconnected to, the average person, right? And so the spin that Bernie is sexist, etc., or whatever the spin was from the Warren campaign was not appealing. But then this claim of Bernie being unelectable does seem to be something which voters at least seem to intuitively think is true, right? People on the media are able to say that and get away with it in a way where the average person might hear that and be like, oh, that's true, right? Like we know sort of as progressives and just, in general, when you look at the evidence, there isn't really a lot of evidence. There isn't really a lot of evidence for that, but it is something which a lot of people seem to find persuasive. So the interesting question is, well, why is that idea persuasive? Why is the idea that Bernie Sanders is unelectable? Why is it the case that that's persuasive? Because it clearly can't just be the case that like, oh, the media says it, and so that means that voters, believe it, right? Clearly, we don't believe everything that the media tells us. So, I mean, I think the interesting point here is that, the entire sort of normie idea of politics, like, the typical person you ask on the street how, you sort of ask them how politics works, you're going to get something along the lines of, there's a left-right spectrum, and on the right, they support free markets, and on the left, it's kind of government intervention into the market. And of course, the obvious implication of that typical left-right sort of idea that the typical person might be walking around with is that government is unnatural and that the market is kind of natural. And so it's, government interference. And while the average person may say, well, look, yes, sometimes we need government interference here and there, but it's still being played on essentially this corporate boardroom, right? Like the entire normie, sort of naive view, typical view of politics is itself a corporate idea of politics, right? So, I mean, man, the propaganda is really, really deep, right? I mean, obviously, we know that that's not how, if you're watching this video, you're probably more into politics than the average person. So we would, we probably understand that that's not really how it works, right? Like on the right, they have, tax cuts and subsidies for all kinds of different agro businesses and different kind of businesses. So like, we understand that that's not actually how it works, but for the typical person, that's kind of how they do ultimately think about it. I mean, it's sort of like, quick aside, it's sort of like, John Locke, right? So John Locke said, of course, that, trade and sort of interaction among peoples is natural. And then in a sense, so government is unnatural. I mean, that's essentially the idea of the social contract, right? Which, by the way, is essentially just is an interesting reversal of Aristotle, because Aristotle, of course, said that humans are political animals and that, the economy is sort of built on top of politics. But anyway, that is ultimately, that is an aside. But the point I do want to make here is, someone who actually does represent, I think, the center to an extent, or represent what an actual center would be, is Joe Rogan. So I want to show you a clip of Joe Rogan actually endorsing Bernie Sanders, and then we're going to talk a little bit about that briefly and a little bit of how this might relate. So here is Joe Rogan.
And if you want a woman president, that's what you want. You want a young woman who has served in Congress, who has served overseas, who's been deployed. She makes a lot of sense with a lot of the things she's saying. That's what I like about her.
Got it.
Okay.
Klobuchar?
Zero opinion on her.
Okay. Yeah, I like her. Zero
Yeah.
charisma, though.
Yeah. I haven't
Can't,
been paying attention. Like, there's certain, look, there's only so much time you have in a day and only so many days in your life.
Yeah.
And until things start really popping where I have to pay attention to her, I'm just like, she ain't got a shot.
But who are you going to vote for in the primary?
I think I'll probably vote for Bernie.
Interesting.
Yeah. Because I think Bernie and Tulsi together would be a fucking devastating combination. I really do. I don't know if they'd ever work out together. I don't know if that's possible. But I think them together might work. That might work. That might get enough people to go, you know what? This is all just too fucking crazy. Let's try something different.
And what do you make of the people that are speculating that Tulsi's going to run as a third party or all that?
She's not going to.
Okay.
I don't think she's going to. I don't think she has any plans to do that. But that was the worry that, she's a Russian asset. That was one of the things that Hillary Clinton had said. That I found that very strange. And Hillary Clinton was calling her a Russian asset.
You found it strange that Hillary Clinton said that?
I do, but I'm not a fan of Hillary Clinton. I'm not a fan of that whole. They're a part of a different world, right? They're a part of a different world where corruption was open and accepted, and it was a part of the program.
I mean, this isn't, I suppose, necessarily an endorsement, but it's more so Joe Rogan saying, "Hey, look, he's going to vote for Bernie Sanders." So, that's interesting. And by the way, this is going to matter a whole lot more than any kind of New York Times endorsement. I mean, the New York Times came out and, as you know, did that debacle of an endorsement where they endorsed Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren, saying that, it's about choosing, which path we want to take. Do we want to take the center path with Amy Klobuchar or the radical path with Elizabeth Warren? As if Elizabeth Warren is just as progressive as Bernie Sanders. And in that endorsement from the New York Times, they say, we shouldn't replace one bomb thrower, Donald Trump, with another bomb thrower, Bernie Sanders. What that shows ultimately is what is the New York Times bias? What is the center, or what is the establishment to the New York Times? To the New York Times, it's about procedure. It's about not messing with the institutions, the established system that we have. You can go left and right, but left and right only exists along these institutions. Left and right can only be defined in terms of the institutions which already exist. Whereas there's another dimension of politics, which, the kind of anti-establishment, or we might call populist side of things, which says, no, look, we need to actually challenge the institutions itself. Going along an idea of left and right is irrelevant if we don't ultimately think about the institutions themselves, not just how the institutions interact with the market, right? We have to, go beyond that idea and move forward too. And so I think, Joe Rogan's understanding of politics and how he takes the center to be is far more accurate than the New York Times' approach to what the center is, because I think the average person does think that, look, we need to challenge the institutions. We have to go beyond asking questions of only how the institutions which exist interact with the market. We also need to think about the institutions themselves, and also we need to think about whether or not, right, the market is itself an institution, right? Treat the market as an institution. And that's sort of the center which Joe Rogan, in a sense, I think intuitively kind of grasps, intuitively sort of understands. And so, and I do think that Joe Rogan's endorsement is just going to be more influential. I mean, just how many people listen to Joe Rogan, it's insane. But by the way, the interesting point here that I think is relevant here is, what does this mean? It means that there's ultimately a discrepancy between how we as individuals, or how the average person like Joe Rogan, for instance, thinks about politics, and then how they think other people think about politics, right? Because if you turn around and ask, not necessarily Joe Rogan, I think, Joe Rogan's pretty smart. He talks to a lot of people. So maybe not Joe Rogan, but the person who might think like Joe Rogan, you ask them how politics works, it's going to be that normie view that I, espoused earlier. But then if you ask them how they themselves think about politics, they'll be you know, and who they support, they'll be a little bit more like the kind of Joe Rogan side. But what I'm trying to say is how they think is different from how they think other people think. And that, I think, is ultimately super, super key when it comes to understanding politics and understanding the world itself, because it means that politics is not merely about persuading other people to support this or that particular policy or even supporting this or that theory of change. It's also about persuading other people to think about how other people think about politics as different. And only when we persuade people to believe that other people also think that of politics in another way, then the question of electability changes, right? Only when you change the minds of people, change how people like. I mean, I guess I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but it's really, really what I'm saying is it's much more difficult. It's about much more than just persuading people to support particular things. It's also about persuading people to think that other people think differently and getting those other people to think that that other person thinks differently. And at the end of the day, that's what politics is. And I don't know, I just thought that was really kind of an interesting thing, and that's sort of my understanding of electability. But anyway, here is the second clip from Krystal Ball.
I mean, those comments are, first of all, they're just sort of mean. Like, nobody likes him. I mean, are we in junior high? But second of all, especially with this poll coming out, look how out of touch this looks. And this is, I think, a failure that a lot of DC has had, which has made them underestimate Bernie Sanders. Yeah, if you listen to cable news all day, if you just hang out in this town, you're going to think nobody likes Bernie Sanders. But again, the polls consistently show he is actually the most popular candidate in the race. New rankings came out. He's the most popular senator in the entire country. So that's part of why. No, that literally came out last week. Morning Consult polling ranked him as the #1 most popular senator in the entire country. But second of all, why do people like him so much? It's precisely because DC hates him. People hate DC. The fact that he didn't come here to make friends, that he came here to stand up for the working class, is precisely why he is so consistently popular across polls.
And Krystal, why haven't you endorsed him in 2020?
Well, I mean, I work for The Hill. I like all of the anti-establishment candidates, and so I'm staying out in terms of putting out an endorsement. But I mean, there's no doubt about it. I like Bernie. I like his focus on the working class. I think that's exactly what we do need to bring the country together. And by the way, worth noting with all this like Bernie bro narrative that's arising, it's really ugly to sort of invisibilize his supporters of color. And in the CNN poll, he leads Joe Biden among people of color. So I think we need to put this whole Bernie bro narrative to bed too.
But the Bernie bro stuff is that some of his supporters are aggressive online.
Well, actually,
but it's about
hold on. The Bernie
young
bro stuff,
white men is what it's about.
But Krystal, the Bernie bro stuff is very real. And actually, I do give his campaign, and in 2016, to the point where, I mean, we actually had to ask his campaign because women, it was so bad for a lot of women. I give his campaign credit this time in that I don't think that they're trying, I think they recognize that it was problematic.
Okay, I mean, you just saw there Karen Finney completely and absolutely dismissing the idea that Bernie Sanders could be the most popular senator, because to her that idea is absurd. That couldn't be the case. That's ridiculous. Like, oh, look, that couldn't be the case. That couldn't be the case. Let me just show you the evidence right here. So you see here Bernie Sanders up at the top as the most popular senator. And by the way, it's not like this is the first time, because, you know, if this was like the first time that Bernie Sanders had been the senator, you know, this poll just came out and before he wasn't, then you could be like, okay, well, she hasn't seen the poll yet. But that's not the case. This is, I think, like the 10th or I don't know. Bernie Sanders has been the most popular senator now for a long time. So, you know, and to be fair, though, it's not necessarily that she... I think honestly what it is the people who she hangs out with, the people who is in her social circle, to her, as we were talking about the divisiveness point earlier, to her, Bernie Sanders is divisive because it's again, it's about the question of the institutions in the market, whether or not the market is itself an institution and whether or not questioning institutions is a question of politics. I mean, it's, you know, to her, those are divisive questions, but to the average person, those things are not ultimately divisive. To the average person there, it's, you know, that's just how things work. Now, I do just want to show you the CNN poll itself here. and look at a few of the numbers here, because I think it's actually really interesting. So here are the numbers. So as I said, Bernie Sanders up at the top with 27%, and this is a 7-point rise from last time, from December, when he was at 20 points. Now you can also see here Joe Biden slipped 2 points here in the poll. He was at 26, and then he is now at 24. So Joe Biden slipping a little bit. And so then the other thing I do just want to quickly look at is the RCP average. So you can see here Bernie Sanders has been consistently going up here. Really just from even in the past like 10 days or so, Bernie Sanders has gone up in just the average like 3 points, which is pretty big. So here is the CNN poll, and obviously the CNN poll is a little bit of an outlier. The other polls do still seem to be showing Biden ahead, but showing Bernie Sanders coming up is, there is the general trend here, because if you look at some of the earlier polls from previously, Biden plus 10, plus 11, now more recently we've been seeing Biden plus 7, and then now Biden plus 3. And of course, we do have the Sanders plus 3 from the CNN poll. So the general trend does seem to be showing Bernie Sanders is going up, even if the general trend doesn't show Bernie Sanders up at the top in the same way that this single CNN poll shows. So, always look at the aggregate. That's always important. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked it, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.